No one shall be forgotten who was great in this world, but everyone who was great in his own way, and everyone in proportion to the greatness of what he loved. For he who loved himself became great in himself, and he who loved others became great through his devotion, but he who loved God became greater than all. For he who always hopes for the best becomes old, deceived by life, and he who is always prepared for the worst becomes old prematurely, but he who has faith retains eternal youth. The great can never do harm when grasped in their greatness. I am not unacquainted with life's needs and dangers. I do not fear them, and I go to meet them undaunted. Faith is a marvel, and yet no human being is excluded from it, for that in which all human life is united is passion, and faith is a passion. He who loves God without faith reflects on himself, while the person who loves God in faith reflects on God. Deeper natures never forget themselves and never become something other than they were. Through faith I don't renounce anything. On the contrary, in faith, I receive everything, exactly in the way it is said that one whose faith is like a mustard seed can move mountains. It takes a purely human courage to renounce the whole of temporality in order to win eternity. Now, when the ethical is thus teleologically suspended, how does the single individual in whom it is suspended exist? He exists as the particular in opposition to the universal. Does this mean he sins? For this is the form of sin looked at ideally, just as the fact that the child does not sin because it is not conscious of its own existence as such does not mean that, looked at ideally, its existence is not that of sin, or that the ethical does not make its demands of the child at every moment. Abraham's story contains a teleological suspension of the ethical. He has, as the single individual, become higher than the universal. This is the paradox which cannot be mediated. Then faith's paradox is this, that the single individual is higher than the universal, that the single individual determines his relation to the universal through his relation to the absolute, not his relation to the absolute through his relation to the universal. The paradox can also be put by saying that there is an absolute duty to God. The true knight of faith is a witness, never a teacher, and in this lies the deep humanity in him which is more worth than this foolish concern for others' weal and woe which is honored under the name of sympathy, but which is really nothing but vanity. A demon knows how to torture powers out of even the weakest person, and in his way, he can have the best intentions towards a human being. In sin, the individual is already in terms of the demonic paradox higher than the universal, because it is a contradiction on the part of the universal to want to impose itself on someone who lacks the necessary condition. Ethics that ignores sin is an altogether futile discipline, but once it postulates sin, it has gone beyond itself. Philosophy tells us that the immediate is to be superseded. True enough. But what is not true is that sin, any more than faith, is without further ado the immediate. Pity has a curious dialectic. One moment it calls for guilt, the next it wants to do away with it. And so to be predestined to pity is the more dreadful, the greater the individual's misfortune lies in the direction of the spiritual. If only those people who wander about these days with vague talk of the idea of the congregation would read the New Testament, they might come upon other ideas. He who loves God has no need of tears, needs no admiration, and forgets his suffering in love. Indeed, forgets so completely that afterwards not the least hint of his pain would remain were God himself not to remember it. For God sees in secret, and knows the distress, and counts the tears, and forgets nothing. The highest passion in a human being is faith, and here no generation begins other than where its predecessor did. Every generation begins from the beginning. The succeeding generation comes no further than the previous one, provided the latter was true to its task and didn't betray it.